make it unintimidating, but also make it usable. And so for the developer, it's make it incredibly configurable. For the other user, it's like make it really easy. You need to like balance both of those in one product. That's the challenge.
Hi everyone, you're listening to Scaling DevTools. I'm joined today by someone who I've known for a very long time and have been friends with for a very long time, Hamzah Chaudhary, who is the co-founder and CEO of Lightdash. And Lightdash is a BI tool, open source BI tool, that is absolutely blowing up right now. So Hamzah, it's so great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. It's exciting to be here.
So I know that you're bringing a lot of like software engineering best practices to BI, but could you talk a bit about what Lightdash does and what BI is for any devs who may not have delved into that realm?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about BI and then happy to tell you about Lightdash as well to set the scene. So BI, for folks who are wondering, is business intelligence. And really what that means is for most companies, once your data starts getting more complex than just sort of the sort of out of the box product analytics that you might start with as a company, and you start needing to aggregate multiple different sources of data. So a really simple example might be pulling in Stripe data alongside some event analytics data, potentially a third or fourth source. Could be some user data, could be, click ads data from Facebook, something like that. You start having different requirements on how complex the data model is, and then the visualizations that you want to create on top of that. And that's really where data visualization tools like BI, like business intelligence tools like Lightdash become more helpful, because you want to be able to create that complex data model and then have a really easy way for people to visualize and interact with it. So that's a little bit about business intelligence, and kind of where Lightdash fits in is, we're built on two things. Like one is built on open source. And so I'm a big believer in open source software. And so it's, I think having, particularly when it comes to user event data and that sort of stuff, having the ability to control how that sort of flows through your system, I think is super important. But then the other thing is, we want to bring a lot of the best practices from software engineering to the world of data. Most BI tools today kind of live in this ClickOps world where everything is UI driven. Actually, we think about it a little bit differently, where we want everything to sort of be CLI and code driven, programmatic as much as possible. And that was really the kind of kernel for Lightdash.
Yeah. And when I first met you, you were a software engineer I think it was more than 10 years ago. And you were also on the weekends occasionally teaching coding with a bunch of us. And I know that you're also working with Cytora, which was like a very, very data intensive company. So I have a little bit of background about like where you got to Lightdash, but could you share a little bit about like how you came to Lightdash?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like you mentioned, started off as a software engineer a long time ago. And yeah, the last company I was at, Cytora, where you and I met you when I was working there. So I joined as their second engineering hire, and ultimately I ended up being responsible for all of our data pipelines and data analytics. And so that involved everything from data ingestion through to data modeling, and then also outputs. So we were building machine learning models at the time, serving those up to folks in sort of the insurance and banking industries. And what I learned was that our data teams basically were woefully underprepared from a tooling perspective compared to the software engineering side of the business.
Interesting.
It was kind of like this wild west where, on the data side, it was just sort of tumbleweeds, CSVs being thrown around, things being saved in Google Drive. It was like no idea about like things like Git, version control, like productionization in terms of like having preview and dev environments, production environments, all that sort of stuff. So one of my first jobs when I sort of took over that team was literally just thinking about what tools can I empower the team with that will help them sort of, get some of that leverage that software engineers have enjoyed for so long, and that makes engineers really good at being able to sort of scale their impact and kind of gain leverage. It turns out there really isn't that much, like in the data world, like those tools just didn't exist. And so when I left Cytora, it's also where I met my now co-founder, Oliver. So Oliver and I kind of became really interested in this concept of like treating data people more like software engineers. And if you did that, what would the tool set, what would the workflow look like? And after a couple of iterations, we landed on Lightdash as this sort of open source business intelligence, which is like very code driven. Works in the CLI, works with IDEs, works native to kind of all those things. And that's kind of always been the mission from day one, is to try and empower data people to be able to work more like software engineers. And what we mean by that is just to gain leverage, right? To be able to do more with less. That's kind of the approach that we've had.
Yeah. And when you kind of landed on it, what did it look like at first? Like, did you just kind of go out and throw something out there? Like, how did it?
Yeah, no. So actually, when we left the company, we really thought we were going to be bootstrapped. So we were like, we're going to do this our way. So we set up a consultancy. So we were doing data consultancy for companies. We were like building and managing data stacks for them. This was in January of 2020. It was a great time to start a new company in the world.
Okay. Yep. Great time. Great 3 months.
It was an exciting time, to say the least. But yeah, one of the companies that we were working with was actually linked to the Department of Education here in the UK.
Interesting.
And so what we were doing for them was basically helping aggregate a lot of data around online curriculums that kids were watching during the pandemic. So, a lot of schooling went online. And so the government was really interested in what were the viewership rates for different subjects and all that sort of stuff. And so we were one of the companies that were helping sort of aggregate all that data for the Department of Education. So we built and managed those data pipelines. And actually, Lightdash was built as an internal tool initially just for Oliver and I to actually manage that consultancy business, because we didn't want to pay for one of the really big BI tools. And so I was like, I think we can build something better because it's just for us. Inevitably, somebody from our customer side saw that product.
What's that?
Yeah, they were like, "What's that?" It looks a bit janky, but like I'm kind of interested. And so we kind of spilled the beans on what it was, and they asked it to use it, and kind of like I guess like a fair number of startups, like the rest is history, and that sort of became like our main focus. We were really driven to be like, no, like that's just like the side project. We're building this consultancy. But like a few people pulled it out of us, and then we kind of realized that maybe this is the thing. And then the consultancy kind of stopped, and Lightdash carried on.
Wow, that's very cool. And so were you just working with those kind of existing clients?
Yeah, initially we started by working with those existing clients, and then we started writing the first lines of kind of Lightdash in, I think, towards the end of 2020, sort of beginning of 2021. And then put it onto Hacker News. And so we posted it onto Hacker News, and the first comment we got, we gave it like a really bad title. We tried to be like extremely verbose with like what it was and very complex.
Do you remember what it was, just for people's reference?
I'm probably too embarrassed to remember, but I think it is something like the analytics like pipeline tool for your like data development. It was like really, really long and like really unhelpful.
Okay.
And then someone commented saying like, "Oh, this is like open source Looker," and I was like, "That's a much better name." And so for like the next like sort of year, we ran with that as like the tagline. It's like the open source Looker alternative.
That's great.
Yes, that was like the story of how Lightdash got shared with the world. And then after we launched on Hacker News, kind of things started picking up far more organically, and like a lot of open source tools, kind of built a community after that as well.
Yeah, and what was it like when you got that kind of like influx? Like how did you manage that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in the earliest days of the product, I think there's always an excitement, and you get like that. I think it's called like the Hacker News hug, or maybe people used to call it the product hunt hug, where you get like that little spike, and then hopefully everything kind of stays up. I think for us, when we launched on Hacker News initially, I don't even think you if you could spin up the open source version, I don't even think there was like a login page. Like it was just like an open source app, and there was very little that people could do with it.
Yeah.
But the exciting bit was how many folks kind of hung around because they liked what we were building.
Yeah.
So in the earliest days of the product, very few people could actually productionize it. But I was really surprised by how far people took that current state of the product. And I think that was probably the thing that gave us more conviction that this was something that people needed, was that folks were already taking that early version where you couldn't even invite anyone to it. It was just you inside this app. and they were, doing really, really impressive things with it. But in terms of like, how did we deal with like an overwhelmingly large number of kind of inbound users? I think the answer is we probably didn't handle it incredibly well. Like we try to spin up a community and be like, come and talk to us, tell us what you think.
Yeah.
And that was kind of it. But the main thing was gave us like enough conviction to keep building.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you remember like how you, cause it's something that I launched something recently, and it's like a challenge that I have. It's like how you, like, there's probably just two of you at this time, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think there's three of us, but yeah, that
three
was
of you. Yeah. And it's like, you're getting tons of requests, and probably each one of them takes like a week to fulfill or something. And it's like, just can't possibly do it all. Like, how are you kind of?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there's probably two things that matter there. I think one is like having a focus is really important, because you are right when you share stuff. I think it's like one thing that I know a lot of open source founders have kind of mentioned, which is because you have this like incredible amount of feedback coming in, it's so important to also still be a little bit focused on like, well, what was the vision when we started? And, making sure you're actually like still building a little bit towards that. Because like folks will always ask for things, but they don't necessarily, it's like kind of seeing the forest through the trees and being like, are you still building the thing that you set out to build? And does this still like look and feel close to what you tried to do? Of course, you're going to take user feedback on board, but I think it's still important to like have your opinion of how you want the product to it's the whole like faster horse versus a car thing. And it's like, you really want to make sure you're still building the car that you set out to build.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is more around like the sequencing of what kinds of users you meet. And we got kind of lucky where I think in the earliest stages of Lightdash, all the requests were very similar. Like I actually found it a little bit weird that in a week, like 7 or 8 people would request the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So we never had this problem, where you get like extremely disparate feature requests. And I think that had to do with just like, we were really focused on like a very specific type of person that we wanted to target at every single stage. And so as the companies like evolved, and if you like now target like different sizes of companies or different people, like we found that those feature requests tend to like sit in the same bucket. So it's quite nice from that perspective.
And who are your target? Who are your targets?
Yeah, so we work with, it's sort of like a very technical data analyst. So they're not, they're not sort of fully fledged engineers. The way I describe them is they're folks who are like SQL savvy, Python dangerous, but they're definitely not sort of like fully fledged devs who are, super comfortable spinning up Kubernetes clusters and kind of managing everything themselves. But they're definitely, IDE ready, CLI native, that sort of stuff. It's like this new sort of breed of data analyst where they are definitely more technical than sort of just working in a spreadsheet. And they kind of need tools that kind of meet them at their workflow.
Yeah. And so where do these people hang out? Like, how have you been kind of growing? And
yeah, that's a good question. So there's so we work with a bunch of other open source tools and communities, and probably the biggest one today for the data folks is kind of DBT. Has built this really large open source community of data practitioners, and they also coined, there's like this new term now called analytics engineering, which maybe is a better way of describing that persona that I just mentioned to you.
Yeah. Python dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. And so we actually still work really closely with the DBT community, and those sort of folks have been really, really good to us. But I think we kind of hung out in a bunch of open source communities like that and tried to find other tools in the space that we thought were complementary or kind of believed in the same vision of what we were doing. And that tends to be where folks kind of found us and probably still do find us. I think like the majority of our inbound today still comes from open source communities. A lot of that from, teams like DBT as well.
Yeah. That's really cool. And like, would you have any like advice for anyone listening in terms of like working with, when you're like a startup and you start to work with like a really established player as like a kind of partner or within their ecosystem?
I think it's probably what I mentioned earlier, which is to be like super clear about your vision for something. I think everybody, and this is like, investors, friends, family, partners, everybody will have like a different vision for where they think your like product and company could go. And it's pretty easy for it to become diluted quite quickly if you're not like
try and please everyone.
Yeah, because you're trying to please everyone, and also you kind of like, I think as a founder particularly, you often sometimes value other people's opinion more than your own, either because you think someone's more successful or whatever it might be. And I actually think the opposite is almost always true, where you know your problem better than anyone else. And actually, a lot of folks like give out opinions that I find are like very fast opinions, but because they're really intelligent, they sound really good. So you can often like over-index on them. Whereas like in actual fact, and that's not to say, by the way, that those people are kind of doing anything untoward. It's just that like they're really smart and they can come up with like opinions very quickly. But in actual fact, you've spent like hundreds of hours thinking about like that problem, that product. So like, kind of like trusting your own judgment on that, I think is super important for like holding your own vision for it. But yeah, that's the same is true for when you're working with a big company. I think, DBT for us have been great. They're an awesome company to work with. But I think it has been really useful for us to always kind of hold in our minds, like, well, what is really important to us? Like, how do like we make sure we carve our path? And then, yeah, like the way you get successful partnerships is by having like our incentive align with their incentive, and they kind of want to do something because it works for them and it works for us. And if you can find that, then hopefully you'll get like commercial success as well.
Yeah. That's it's really interesting that you talk about the vision and kind of like holding on to like what because that totally resonates with me, that it can be really easy to just hear something that sounds like so legit and like from someone so smart. You're like, I guess I was thinking about this all wrong. And then in open source in general, I know that like you've been doing really well in open source, and I mean, got like a crazy number of stars now and it seems like tons of activity. How have you kind of managed to scale beyond, those first like, people coming in from Hacker News and liking it to like where you are now?
So like, I think for us at least, it's been a couple of things. Like one is the open source community kind of keeps growing. And so every time we think that we're like, okay, like this is probably the level out moment, that just doesn't seem to happen, which is amazing. But a lot of it has now been that like, when Lightdash gets rolled out at a company, it tends to go really wide. So every person at the company will have exposure to Lightdash, from the data team, but also all the way to like marketing, sales, FinOps. It tends to be, when a company starts building their core KPI dashboards in Lightdash, that tends to go to everyone. And so we get this like really wide spread, and, with the natural sort of movement of folks through companies, a lot of what we get now is folks moving to a new organization and saying like, we used to use this really cool tool called Lightdash. And we're probably like just about old enough where that is true. We're like, we've been around for like a few years now. So there's folks who used this like 2 years ago and are now like in a new company and kind of bringing us there. That tends to be like that definitely is happening like more and more often, which is really, really nice.
That's awesome.
And maybe the other one is more just, I think there's like a natural network effect inside open source that is really cool, which is, once folks start developing a feature, they also want to kind of show it off, or kind of if they contribute back to the core product, they want to show that off themselves. And so we get a lot of folks who are, building really cool things on top of Lightdash and then sharing that with their own communities or their own sort of audiences. And that kind of like naturally brings us like more folks back to the core product.
That's really cool. So they're like is that actually part of like core Lightdash, or is it like they'll have another repo that like kind of plugs in, or like?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. Like I put them into like three buckets. Like one is folks who've actually contributed absolutely massive features to Lightdash, where I would not have expected them to be able to like do something like that, but they've pulled it off, and it's incredible.
Some people are just amazing. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. It's incredibly impressive. I'm always impressed by like how much people can do, and it puts me to shame for like how like my level of engineering ability, I think. And then the other two versions are, like folks who have some sort of plugin or some sort of other stack that they've built on top of Lightdash, with sort of Lightdash powering it almost as like a, like an OEM type service.
Yeah.
And then the third one, we actually get folks who just build really cool open source kind of data sets or data visualizations that they share with the community. So like two really cool ones that come to mind. It started as an open source, and this company actually now works with us as well. They sort of monitor ocean health.
Oh, really?
So this company has like the single biggest data set of like ocean health from like plastic and microplastic pollution. They use Lightdash to create this. open dashboard that sort of anyone could interact with and kind of build. That was obviously incredibly cool, like a really cool like use case for the product. And that was like one way. It started as someone who built it as like something for a conference that they shared. They were used our open source technology and ended up like rolling that into their company. And then the other end of the not the other end of the spectrum, but kind of different. We work with a company that has the largest data set of like auction data for Pokemon cards.
No way.
Yeah.
How much is the most expensive one?
Oh man, I think it's in the seven figures for sure. It's in this, yeah. And so, they wanted a way to share that data set with the world. And so they did the same thing. They sort of like built, a bunch of interactive dashboards and sort of data sets in Lightdash and kind of gave that back to the open source community. So I think those sorts of contributions I always find like really fascinating because there's just lots of interesting data sets in the world that I don't get to see, but I have the fortune of being able to work with companies that have them. So it's super cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. I need to check the ocean one. UK's oceans, or the UK's like sea beaches are getting pretty polluted these days.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Amazing. And so we touched on it very briefly, but you talked a bit about bringing software engineering practices to analytics, to BI. Yeah. Could you talk a bit about that, about what it's been like? Any things that have been challenging or anything surprising that you've kind of learned in that process?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, for sure. I think from a business intelligence perspective, like I mentioned, most tools up until today have kind of relied on being very UI driven. So like the status quo is that everything happens through like a drag and drop editor or some cloud-based IDE, if there is one. The problem with that is that it's really hard to like build any sort of developer workflow. And I always try to think in terms of like what's like the flywheel of development that exists in your product. Like what small cog turns a bigger cog. And for business intelligence, it's really quite straightforward. Like a data team's responsibility is to try and like build these data models that are reusable. So the example that I often tell folks that to kind of bring this to life a bit more is take revenue inside a company. Revenue is like a really easy term to understand, but typically is very difficult to calculate because like data is quirky. And in any single business, they're going to say like, hey, like actually you need to like, join these two data sets, deduplicate this, and then like, take away 10 and multiply by 4. And then that's how you get like our revenue calculation.
Really? I did not realize that was that hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Data is funky and like it always should be really simple. It should just be like, sum the total of Stripe, but like
just check Stripe.
Yeah. But often in like businesses, it just doesn't end up being that way because things happen.
Yeah. I suppose a lot of it's like even code at uni back in the day, like we'd have invoices for like some things and then we'd have Stripe for other things. And I can see that was like a tiny company. I can see how it gets like.
It can get complex quick. But like what we wanted to do is we wanted folks to codify those sorts of definitions and basically store them in, make them immutable as code. And so with Lightdash, what we do is we have this notion that those sorts of metrics that are key to your business, those should be like Git version controlled, stored in GitHub, and very difficult for people to change unknowingly. So like you really have to like know what you're doing to change it, but really easy to pull from. And so in Lightdash, there's kind of two workflows: one for the developer and one for the non-technical's unkind, but like the business user who is like, I'm not necessarily the SQL person. I'm just trying to like build the report that I'm interested in to do my job. So I'm pulling revenue. I'm looking at it, cut by region, cut by whatever the thing is that we're interested in, and move on and kind of use it to do my job. And the way that we found to do that effectively is to give folks access to those pre-built metrics. So this notion of like a metrics layer where you have a bunch of things that are unique to your business, and you have those defined and stored as code, and then everything else kind of happens in the UI. And so from a developer workflow perspective, we kind of built the ability to use things like your local IDE, to leverage CLI tooling, to make it really quick for data people to build and manage those metrics. So you actually start from code, you write everything, you can have a sort of like hot reloading at the same time. So you have the Lightdash UI app, and like as you're creating metrics, you can see in real time, how changing some calculation in your metric changes a dashboard, changes a chart that you've already built. And then when you're happy with it, you can sort of push it to production, send it to staging, open a PR, have validation, have testing. And it's really just like bringing a level of like productionization and maturity to that data workflow that gives people like reassurance. That's the main thing, right? Like you don't want your COO to be looking at a report or a dashboard that is like out of date or broken because someone did something and there was just no tracking and no audit trail or no version history that you can like roll back on.
Yeah, this is so cool. This is yeah, it's so it's so obvious. Like when you say it, it's like, that's like clearly a much better way to work than like dragging stuff around and just,
yeah.
I don't know. I guess that's how were people doing it before? It's just like dragging.
A lot of it was that. And to be clear, I think that's still the right workflow for a certain set of people. I think it's more recognizing that there are two personas involved. Like there is, and particularly this is unique to, I guess, tools like Lightdash. They become relevant at companies once you have someone whose full-time focus it is to look after the data inside your company. And so that person's workflow is always going to be different to the person who's consuming the data. The person who's interacting with a dashboard, like, yes, for them, go UI driven, make it easy to drag and drop.
Make a small change.
Yeah, make small changes, that sort of stuff. But like changing core parts of like your reporting infrastructure, that sort of thing is like a different workflow.
Yeah.
And so think of it as like levels of abstraction where like the least abstracted is like you write a raw SQL query. And so there you can do anything you want, right? You can write as long as you know SQL, you can create any query that you want. And like the least abstracted is like, I ask you to send me a number, right? Like I tell you like, hey, tell me how much money we made last week. And I'm just going to send you the number and like, that's the number. And so like, there are like levels in between those of like, depending on what abstraction you're at, there are different actions that you should be allowed to do. And that's like, how do you give people guardrails without giving them stop signs around how they can interact with data without it being overwhelming? That's kind of the trick. That's like the trick that BI tools have to figure out. And Lightdash is doing that as well, which is like, make it unintimidating, but also make it usable. And so for the developer, it's make it incredibly configurable. For the other user, it's like make it really easy. You need to like balance both of those in one product. That's the challenge.
Yeah, I think that's the soundbite for the episode of like guardrails without stop signs.
There you go.
I actually feel like this is quite an interesting thing, and this is a massive aside. But like, do you think there's any other things which are like kind of ripe to be like bring software engineering best practices to? Because I've not seen people like think about that, but it's like such an interesting thing.
I don't know if I'm like qualified to say like what are the things like.
Just throw out loads of things.
I think like when we talk about Lightdash, we talk about like data, like bringing it to the world of data. I think like that actually spans like lots of different areas that Lightdash doesn't cover all of them. Like for example, the one that when we started the company that I was really interested in was like the machine learning data science workflow. Even though like Lightdash focuses more on like data analytics and like business reporting, I think like there's that people used to see like the sexy side of data as like the data science, machine learning, like the model building. That was the world that I came from. And that world was like even worse than like the analytics world, right? Like it's very like academic for the most part. So there's very little sort of thought gone in necessarily into like how the workflows can be super optimized. That's now changing. Now you have like tons of companies doing MLOps, thinking about MLOps pipelines, how you deploy, machine learning models to production, all that sort of stuff. And the LLMs have kind of changed that entirely. But I still think that like the developer workflows for those, like, it's not about copying software engineering and copy and pasting. It's about like the principles, right? Like, how do you copy the principles of like version control, of like, dry engineering principles, that sort of stuff. And like, which ones are relevant to this like new area? So I think that's probably the most interesting one for me is like, I see like the data science world and LLMs as a technology separate from like LLMs as a developer workflow. Like how do you develop it and use this technology? That bit, I think I'm like keenly watching because I'm interested to see like what the developer workflow will look like there and like what parts of software engineering will come over and keep making sense and which parts like won't or will have to adapt. If there's anything like super left field, I can't think of like what it might be that needs like software. I'm thinking about like whether like cooking or gardening, is like right for like
software engineering.
Yeah, but like I can't make it stick right now.
Yeah. Or maybe like don't repeat yourself if you're mowing the lawn.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was terrible. I edited that out. Yeah. Okay. So Hamzah, I think we're coming towards the end, but what's next for Lightdash? What have you got planned?
Yeah, so I think on the product side, we were working on some really, really exciting stuff. I think we've been thinking a lot about what does the world look like once you've sort of commoditized like this dashboarding and reporting layer for data people. Like, what are the really cool, exciting things you would do if you knew that your data was like as reliable as an API? So if you did that, like, what other things would you want to build? And there's like a really exciting like number of exploding use cases that we're seeing from customers. Everything from like, building and training AI analysts to actually developing entire applications off of this like backend data API. And I think I'm really excited about that world of, we call it like operational analytics, where you're actually like using your data to do other things, like plug them into other tools and perform actions in other parts of like your business. That's all possible because we're treating data as code and like treating it like a software product. So I think for me on the product side, like that's definitely like this exciting world that we're moving towards. That I'm grateful that Lightdash is hopefully going to be a big part of. I think that's on the product side, and from a team perspective, it's just I'm very grateful I get to work with incredible people every day internally and our partners, and we want to keep growing them. So we're hiring on the engineering side, on the data side, everywhere. It's good times ahead for Lightdash.
Amazing. And where can people learn more about Lightdash and about you?
So with me, feel free you could find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And then Lightdash, we have an open Slack community. So you're more than welcome to join and kind of learn more about some of the use cases of what folks are building. And if you're keen to hear more about the product, find us there. And on GitHub, if you star the repo, we will plant a tree or remove a kilogram from the ocean for you.
That's awesome. Okay. I will star it if I haven't already.
There you go.
Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Hamzah, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Jack.